Today I'm going to make the pigment Cobalt Green, which is an inorganic green pigment with a unique blue tone to it. To get started, I need to make Cobalt Chloride by dissolving cobalt metal in hydrochloric acid. Using hydrochloric acid will take a lot longer than the much more expensive nitric acid, but it forms this really beautiful sapphire blue color that I'm a big fan of. Anyway, while my cobalt continues to dissolve, I'm going to move on to my next step, which is to make zinc hydroxide by neutralizing zinc chloride with either sodium or potassium hydroxide. For this step, it's really only important that your pH does not exceed 9, because if it does, your zinc hydroxide might redissolve into a sodium-zinc complex, which you really don't want. In any case, once my pH reaches 9, I pass my zinc hydroxide through a filter to remove all of the excess water before baking it in an oven for about 2.5 hours. The heat will drive off all the excess moisture, and I'm left with these big chunks of zinc hydroxide, which I then need to powder in a mortar and pestle. This is done until I can't feel any more grit, and then I set this aside and go back to my cobalt chloride. After a few hours, all of my cobalt metal has dissolved, and the solution is such a dark blue it looks almost purple. My next step is going to be to neutralize this cobalt chloride with sodium carbonate to make cobalt carbonate. To do this, I first add a bunch of excess water, which turns the solution a bright red. I then make small additions of sodium hydroxide in order to neutralize most of the remaining acid. When most of the excess acid is neutralized, these purple plumes of cobalt hydroxide will stay around longer, and I can switch to adding my sodium carbonate. Now technically, you can just use carbonate here and skip the hydroxide entirely, but the problem is you're going to have to deal with a lot of bubbling that's going to produce cobalt aerosols, which are toxic and potentially carcinogenic. Regardless, once my cobalt carbonate is done, I process it the same way I did my zinc hydroxide by filtering, drying, and pulverizing in a mortar and pestle. My only note here is to again be careful with this stuff because there is evidence that shows that cobalt salts are carcinogenic. Anyway, my next step is to grind together 1 part cobalt carbonate with 9 parts zinc hydroxide. This ratio is standard for the production of this pigment, but using more cobalt will result in a darker green, while using less cobalt will result in a lighter green, so keep that in mind. The resulting powder is transferred to a ceramic dish and then cooked in a kiln at 1200 degrees Celsius for about 6 hours. I did this along with a lot of other pigments, and I'll do videos on them all eventually. Next is probably going to be a modern take on cerulean if you're interested. Anyway, after being allowed to cool, this is what my raw pigment looks like. It's a very dark green, and it's rock solid and was very, very difficult to break apart. I ended up using a hammer to crush it into as small pieces as possible, and then I move on to my cleaning step. This cleaning step is done to remove any unreacted cobalt carbonate or zinc hydroxide, and I do it by rinsing the mixture thoroughly with 2 molar hydrochloric acid, water, and then 2 molar sodium hydroxide. I use a Buchner funnel with vacuum filtration for this. It's not necessary, but it's highly recommended. And this is followed by a final water rinse, and then I crush this into a fine powder with the mortar and pestle. And that is the entire process. This is my final pigment, Cobalt Green, or Rinmann's Green. It's a quite uniquely beautiful color that's nearly impossible to make by mixing together any other pigments, but despite this, it's not really used anymore and has been pretty much completely replaced by chromium green. This is due to its relatively low relative opacity, but I think Cobalt Green is uniquely beautiful in its own regard and deserves to exist. In any case, as a final little demo, I crush it up with some linseed oil as I usually do, and try to paint on a piece of white paper with it. As I said, it has relatively limited opacity, and it's kind of grainy due to my lack of a molar, but it still looks really nice. As a side note, I have decided that I'm going to remake every single one of my pigment videos in collaboration with my girlfriend, who is an artist. Those videos will be shot on DSLR and posted on YouTube, and she will be handling the paint demonstration and molding side of things, so hopefully the videos will be higher quality. In any case, as always, I hope you found this interesting, and follow to see more.